All right, this first presentation is meant to introduce you to the idea of reading this very old, strange, mysterious, but amazing poem that we call Beowulf. And I want to call this introductory presentation Literary Archeology and why we start the year with this poem. Let's imagine we're on an archaeological dig somewhere in Northern Europe and we come across a manuscript that looks like this. Clearly not modern English. Take a minute and try to sound out the words. Try to see if you recognize any words. And try to imagine what you might deduce about what the author of this poem thinks or feels based on what you see here. So take a moment and read through this as best you can. Now, what you probably know watching this is that if you were on an archaeological dig, you wouldn't find a neatly typed manuscript. But let's imagine you transcribed what you found onto this screen and it looked like this. Think to yourself, are there any words that look like modern English words? And what kind of text is this? Do you think this is history? Do you think this is someone writing down current events? Do you think this is literature of some kind? Now, what we do see relatively quickly is that we're looking at a poem. And what we have is a poem that is built differently than the poetic texts are built now that we're most familiar with, namely song lyrics. So the way the Anglo-Saxon text looks now is What we gardena in jerdagum, Theod kuninga, thrim jefrunon, huda aðlingas, ellen frumedon. Oft shield sheffing, sheathena thretum, monegum magdum, meodoseltsla oftea, exoda erlas, síðan erst verð, þegar shaft funden, heithas frofre javad, hverks under voknum verð myndum það, of þeat him ach wilk þara jim sitendra, ofer hrondrada, hira sjolda. Gomban Gildan, that was God kuning. Now, aside from the fact that it's not in English, we recognize that it doesn't rhyme. This poetry is built differently. Because I was raised by someone who loved music from the 60s, I'm a huge Simon and Garfunkel fan, and as a brief aside, so should you be. Simon and Garfunkel have a phenomenal song called Homeward Bound. Understanding that this is from the 60s and you're probably not from the 60s if you're a student in my class, nevertheless, contemporary popular music and Simon and Garfunkel have one thing in common, for the most part, is that the poetry of the lyrics are built on built on vowel repetition, rhyme. Sitting in a railway station, got a ticket for my destination. On a tour of one night stands, my suitcase and guitar at hand. Every stop is neatly planned for a poet and a one-man band. You might like the music, you might not, but regardless of what kind of music you like, the reason we can memorize song lyrics so easily is that Sean, stands, hand, plan, band. Contemporary song lyrics are built based on vowel repetition, rhyme. And we'll notice that whatever this is, and we come to learn that it's Anglo-Saxon poetry, doesn't rhyme. Now, what I've done is I've bold-faced here what the repetitions are. Is that because the Anglo-Saxon language was built the way it was, the poets of the time could memorize thousands of lines of poetry, not like we do with song lyrics, with end rhyme, but by alliteration or the rhyming of consonants, basically, consonant repetition. Gardena Jerdagum, Theod Kuninga, Thrim Yefulan, Shield Sheffing. And we'll notice that if there's a consonant here, there's a little space here down the line. It's called a caesura, a strategic pause. So instead of rhyming at the end of lines like in modern music, we have a half a line, space, a caesura, and another half of line. And the poetry is built on alliteration here and alliteration here. G, G, the thorn and the thorn here, the S, S, S here. So it's just interesting to note that this poetry is structured just utterly differently. The modern translation is as follows. Listen, and this is, oh, by the way, this is exactly as written. In other words, you're going to notice that it's, if I were to translate this word for word, the English doesn't sound that great. Sometimes a word here, a noun, is being modified by an adjective way down here. But anyway, this is literally what you're going to see. Listen, we of the spare Danes in olden days, Yerdagum, days of yore, we might say, of the people's kings, glory heard, how the princes courage showed. Often, shield cheffing from enemies' troops, from many tribes, mead benches deprived. Terrified warriors. At first, he was destitute found, he that for consolation waited, grew under the skies, in honors prospered, until to him each of the neighboring peoples over the whale road obey had to, tribute pay. That was a good king, one of the most important phrases in the poem. So you'll notice if I translated, or any translator translated these words literally, it would be accurate and completely unreadable. The edition we have by excellent poet Sheamusini is the least accurate of all the major translations of Beowulf. The Beowulf scholars often call it Heaney Wolf because it's so utterly and completely his own and not really what's written down all the time. The reason we teach it is it's just so beautiful. And at the end of the day, when you're being introduced to this poem, this is a really nice introduction. So, the Spear Danes in days gone by, and the kings who had ruled them had courage and greatness. We've heard of those princes' heroic campaigns. There was Shield Chieftain, scourge of many tribes, a wrecker of mead benches, rampaging among foes. This terror of the hall troops had come far. A foundling to start with, he would flourish later on as his powers waxed and his worth was proved. In the end, each clan on the outlying coasts beyond the Whale Road had to yield to him. We'll notice this flows much better. Began to pay tribute, that was one good king. This reads like a coherent piece of literature, and it just points to the fact that when you translate poetry like this, you make choices. You make choices to be coherent rather than accurate sometimes, and Heaney does that constantly. Now, the other thing about this poem, starting an English literature course with this poem might seem strange, and the following are the common objections that are completely logical. First, why start a year in something called an English literature course with a book decidedly not written in English. So the fact of the matter is that this poem is actually written about the ancestors of people who were living in England. It's a post-migration tale. The ancestors from maybe Sweden or Norway. It's sort of like if you have family from the Dominican Republic or Ireland or Nigeria, and your family gathers around on holidays and tells stories of the old times, and maybe you have a grandparent or a parent, or maybe you yourself speak that native language. It isn't as if that's not a part of your story. And the fact of the matter is, this is the very first major work of literature in the story of English. If you're an English speaker, this is your first significant story. Okay, so one thing you might recognize is that the more you read Beowulf, the more you feel like this is exactly like The Lord of the Rings. Why can't we just read The Lord of the Rings? Well, two things. The Lord of the Rings would take a heck of a lot longer to read, and I would argue Beowulf's better, and I think Tolkien would too. You notice here Aragorn, the king from The Lord of the Rings, and this is Beowulf from a movie version of Beowulf. They look pretty similar, including the sort of scraggly hair, goatee, scowl that they have going on, neither of which are in the text, by the way. But it's interesting, and just as a side note, if you grow to love Beowulf, you probably will grow to love The Lord of the Rings. If you already love The Lord of the Rings, I can almost guarantee you love Beowulf. They have a kind of an interesting relationship with each other. As I said before, this isn't English. It's Old English or Anglo-Saxon. It's our language in its earliest stages. We can occasionally recognize a word, but for the same reason that we pay special attention to our older relatives when they tell stories, and maybe those stories are even in another language, the same applies here. When was the poem written? It's argued 6th century, 7th century, and Kevin Kiernan, who's a Beowulf scholar, argues the 11th century. The key word is written. The poem wasn't written for a long time. It was eventually written down, but it was orally composed. And we know that the period of Anglo-Saxon England is said to begin around 410, when the end of Roman rule in Britain occurred. And the end of Anglo-Saxon England was around the 11th century when the Battle of Hastings occurred. So it's like a 700-year period of time. Somewhere in there, this amazing poem was conceived, repeated over and over again orally, and eventually transcribed. But it's entirely shrouded in mystery.